Hello and welcome to the Open Matters podcast, the podcast where we talk about open source matters that matter. And today we're going to be talking about the link between print media journalism and open source software. Joining me on today's show is the former editor of the UK's best-selling Linux magazine and also the biggest grossing US computing print title, Linux Format. Neil Mohr, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Neil, tell us a little bit more about your background.
Yeah, I've worked in UK publishing industry for almost 30 years, starting off on Amiga computing, authoring their floppy disks. So that was collating a staggering 1.4 megabytes of software each month. Also happened to run the only bit of commercial code I've ever written, which was the Amiga OS installer. And I ended up editing that title because I was probably the only person left in the building that knew anything about Amigas. And that peaked, I believe, selling about 80,000 copies before I ended up moving to Future Publishing, working on various titles such as PC Answers and freelancing for other titles like PC Plus, PC Format, PC Gamer, and working on various websites like Tech Radar.
So tell us, I say former editor, what happened to Linux Format?
I was editing Linux Format for around 12 years, which was something of a dream job for me. It was a very well thought of title. As you've said, it was the best-selling Amiga title at the time. So we're talking around 2012 time. And sales just effectively started to dwindle just because of competition from the internet, because people can get more up-to-date information off the internet. They like their daily news. They want tutorials and information on demand. And being a print publication that only comes out on a monthly basis, it's hard to compete with that.
And largely the offerings on the internet were free. Is that fair to say?
Free. People love their free stuff. It's a different transaction. So these things we used to call magazines, it's for £5. You get a lovely 100-page collection of news, opinion, reader letters, reviews, tutorials, everything you could want. But why would you spend £5 on that when you get all of that online for free on demand?
Well, that sounds much better, right? Surely this is an excellent scenario. Now we have everything free.
I mean, absolutely. It sounds idyllic, but the problem is you still need to pay people to create this content in the first place. So you have to start to ask where's the funding coming from? What's your business model? And I think originally the idea was that all of this would be advertising funded. If you look back, it feels like Google absolutely drove this with its analytics and advertising platforms. And even though that tracks everyone's tastes with all the worrisome privacy issues that go alongside that, it did provide quite a good founding and foundational funding model that lots of websites really did make a lot of money off. But then you seemed over the years, because of perhaps overloading or the privacy concerns, ad blockers became prevalent, and it feels like on a technology front that the ad blockers have won the day, because when you try to go to many news sites now, the first thing you'll run into is a paywall, because people need to get paid to create this content. And this is even with Google introducing Manifest Free to try and rein back the ad blocking. So the shortfall from the advertising revenue simply led to trying to find revenue from other areas, and that's where affiliate linking then comes into the picture. So the way that works is, say you want to buy a widget, so you go off to your widget review website and you read a review of a widget that you like. You click on the link to buy from Widgets R Us online store, and the editorial website that you read that review gets a cut of the sale. So again, that seems like a reasonable combination with analytics and searching through Google, that everyone's benefiting from this setup. But another side from that is we've had a bit of a gold rush of websites trying to create endless buying guides, review sites that are just content farms with very low quality content, and in some cases they're even just copying and pasting entire other websites. So it then becomes a bit of an arms race between Google and all this fake content.
I'm looking at the notes that you've written. I see you wrote AI schop as a summary of this section. Is that? So
all the things I've been talking about were issues even before AI became prevalent, and now that AI is almost auto-generating this schlop content, the situation is even worse. And you look at this platform that Google's created for itself, where you've got its Google Search, Google Advertising, Google Analytics, and all of a sudden it's now putting AI search results on its front page. So people are no longer clicking through to editorial websites to read reviews or news. They're just staying on the Google front page. So Google's undermining its own business model by undermining its advertising platform. You start to ask yourself, where's this all going to end in terms of, are there even going to be websites left in a few years if people aren't clicking through to them? But then who's going to create the content in the first place for the AI to scrape? And it's a very worrying situation from an editorial point of view.
So journalism is being replaced by content marketing, and these websites, this media, are now beholden to clicks rather than a monthly subscription.
Absolutely. So there's definitely two areas to that. So originally people would go to read news because it was news. It was interesting new events that people wanted to know about. But as the revenue that could generate has reduced, the drive from people running these sites is to produce more affiliate type content that they can get the money from. So then the interest or the level of content being generated is then pushed over to just its editorial type reviews and buying guides, and less focus on the news side of it.
I suppose as well with a magazine, it was more difficult to write clickbait headings for every title as well, for every article. Perhaps you could have that on the front cover, but for the other 99 pages, actually clickbait doesn't work in print media. So that's probably also changed things quite a lot.
I think that's a good point. And this partly ties in with analytics. So managers love analytics. The app is just like the dream product, because you can look at these figures every single day and you can go, we've got to write more about these widgets because they're the ones that everyone are clicking on. There might be other interesting widgets, but because the numbers for those are smaller, you'll never write about them. But with an old print publication, you can't track those numbers quite as carefully or to a finer degree. So there was more room for experimenting with, should we write about this today, or should we write about that on the next issue? There was more room to experiment.
It perhaps forced in a broader perspective to the...
Yeah, forced is almost the wrong word. It just allowed a broader perspective. There was more room for breathing in that way.
Well, I promised our wonderful listeners at the start that this was related to software and open source software somehow. So what are the parallels between what we've seen in journalism and what we are seeing, or what we might see with open source software?
So that is a good question. I think the easiest part of that to grasp is you go back in the day, you pay £5 for a magazine, you get this capsule bit of entertainment, news, reviews, tutorials, comment, great. And then the next month you pay £5 again. And in a similar way for software, at the time, you would buy a software package, comes in a box, you pay your £25, you can install it on as many computers as you want, use it as much as you like. And then say in a year's time, a new version comes out that supports JPEGs. Fantastic, I'll pay £25 again, and the merry-go-round continues. Whereas you jump forward to now, when you look at open source projects, how are they getting revenue to pay the developers and the maintainers and even people to support the community around this? They have the same options available, but are people choosing to use those?
What you're saying is, particularly with open source, you can download it straight away, and that's great. That is one of the wonderful open source freedoms. But often people don't necessarily think about the money side of things. Maybe software grows on trees.
There's some great open source projects out there that have found workable funding models. So take Blender, for example. That started off offering tutorials, and it's ended up getting widespread commercial backing. And I think this all feeds into the ecosystem. And another great creative open source project is Critter. And I think maybe you could say they took a look at GIMP and they learned from the mistakes that GIMP made. And they became very user focused in terms of offering features and an interface that creative artists really love to use. And again, by offering tutorials and a school-based background, they managed to open up interesting revenue streams. But again, not all projects can work in that way.
So, Open source solutions have become very embedded in a huge amount of our modern technology. How do we make sure that these stay maintained, that they stay up to date, particularly given they can be downloaded and used for free? What is the solution? Do we just need to paywall all software, or?
So I think you bring up some good issues there, because it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. So what works for a creative bit of open source software isn't going to work for productivity software. And some of the issues you mentioned there are to do with fundamental infrastructure type problems. And so I think that's where maybe more radical solutions need to be considered to keep those sort of nuts and bolts developments working for critical infrastructure.
And is there any precedent of alternative solutions for funding models, for example, from the world of media?
Yes, oddly enough, for journalism, I mean, one solution that seemed to come out naturally was public broadcasting services. Here in the UK, we got the BBC, the US has got PBS, Germany's got ZDF, and it turns out pretty much every democracy has some type of public broadcasting. And they all have their own variety of funding models, from license fees, direct government funding, subscriptions, donations, sponsorship. But it seems they're all largely there to provide the same services. So part of that is emergency broadcasting, because you need to be able to inform the wider public of any issues. Now, don't laugh at this one. Unbiased news reporting, education, entertainment, and so on. There is a debate at the moment if any of this should exist at all. I mean, it looks like the US has basically defunded PBS. Here in the UK, there's also quite a strong debate of how the BBC should be funded.
It's interesting you raise that, though. Yes, certainly there's questions about whether it is or isn't impartial. But I can't think of anyone who watches things like the documentaries that the BBC produces and is at all critical. You know, David Attenborough is loved worldwide as the narrator for nature. And all of that kind of journalism has been enabled by centralised funding.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Absolutely. You look back where this all started, so back in the 1920s, there was no radio infrastructure, there was no broadcast infrastructure. It was just these individual scientists just demonstrating that, we can do radio broadcasts. And so that was in the 1920s, the BBC started to build up its radio broadcast network. And then there was World War II got in the way a little bit. And after that, I believe they started to build up the TV broadcast infrastructure into the 1950s, where the technology was then at a point where commercial networks took over and started developing independent network. But that all initially required government funding just to get off the ground.
I was looking into this as well since you mentioned it earlier. I found it very interesting. The BBC, they had their own engineering department who were designing transmitters. They were setting the open and technical standards that is now what we're using. And so everyone benefited greatly, including all of the commercial channels, from the massive investment that the government in this country put into the system. So we understand that with public broadcasting. How might that happen then with software? And again, is there any precedent to that you know of?
So I think the parallel here is, if Europe wants to have its own digital infrastructure that's independent, there's a good argument for funding open source infrastructure development. I mean, the argument I would make is that creates the services that are required, the software that's needed, and alongside that, it nurtures local development talent. And you would imagine a thriving industry alongside all of that. Europe, I think, has been criticised for lagging the US in software innovation, and a large reason for that seems to be just simple reliance on US big tech for procurement. It doesn't even need to be a case of funding. Back in 2014, the UK government mandated that all procurement projects needed to support the ODF as the default file format for opening and saving files.
That's open document formats.
That's the one, yeah. And just simply supporting that open standard means you're widening the options for software procurement. You're not focusing on just a single provider. You're not locked in to a single software provider, as well as other advantages such as avoiding file format death and that type of thing.
So essentially, you're saying if we value these services, if we value the infrastructure that open source solutions are providing to our countries, really on a national, on a country scale, we should be investing into the.
Ultimately, the sort of the driving force here is independence, the digital sovereignty that everyone talks around. You don't want to be reliant on just one software provider. That's unhealthy for everyone, I think. And so we do talk a lot about government-funded infrastructure here. That's what we've been talking about. But the ultimate goal isn't for just government to be funding this by itself. It's to seed an infrastructure, an ecosystem with lots of contributors. And the idea is by using open source as the development model, smaller companies can contribute because they tend to be the ones that have all the experience and can provide the energy and the driving force to move these projects forwards. And I think that really would be more healthy and exciting.
That sounds like a win-win. Well, Neil, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us. I gave you a very difficult challenge of linking journalism and software, but I think you've done an admirable job.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much.